Hi there. Welcome back to Prices at the Pumps, our weekly look at all things energy related. Scott Squires, pleased, as always, to be joined by the energy expert, Dan McTeague. Dan, a couple things on the agenda today, but let's get going with prices being set tomorrow and Friday in the Atlantic region. What are consumers going to see when they go to the pumps to fill up the next couple of days?
Bit of a split decision, mixed message. On the gasoline side, they're likely to see a bit of an increase, maybe a penny, a little bit more, a little bit less, nothing great. But on the diesel side, it's actually pretty good news. A decrease of about 6 cents a liter. That's pretty significant considering this time of year when we do see inventories dwindle for diesel and for home heating fuel. So that kind of a decrease is pretty substantial. And I think for many people, it might be a good idea just to hold off. Now, again, regulatory boards have their own formulas and special sauce and ingredients that they put in it. So it can always make a bit of a distortion. But these are the numbers provided by the markets at New York. So those are the ones that the rest of the world follows. And I tend to follow as well. The extent to which utility boards deviate from that, it's entirely up to them. And I'll let them argue that with their politicians and with consumers as to whether or not they're getting a raw deal. You know my position, they're not.
Speaking of prices and where they might be going, what are you seeing geopolitically or on the international market that you feel might have an impact on where prices are going to head, short term, but also into the new year?
Well, I think the markets are completely in disarray. They're not reading the messages correctly, certainly on the supply and demand side. The demand picture continues to be pretty strong, robust, in fact. On the supply side, we continue to see dwindling supplies and projections and outlooks that we'll see about a 2, maybe even a 3% increase in demand next year. There is, in fact, not going to be enough folks out there providing supply, save and except Iran. And the only wild card here is whether the Biden administration has the intestinal fortitude to punish Iran for its work in supporting Hamas and other bad characters. Iran seems to be increasing its production. That's fine. Saudi Arabia and Russia appear to be on a collision course to continue to decrease or at least restrain any increase in production, which will, of course, keep prices pretty buoyant. Having said all that, we're also seeing what could be interpreted as positive news, and that's that central banks around the world are throttling back a little bit on raising interest rates. They may be taking a bit of a wait and see approach. I know here in Canada, we're going to see a pretty dramatic drop in our inflation rate. My prediction is that this time next week, we're going to see about a 2.8% interest rate, or rather inflation rate, compared to 4% last month. And it'll also continue for next month, so well into December. And that's because, Scott, we're looking at diesel prices that are about 55 cents a liter cheaper than they were this time last year, gasoline about 12 cents. Based on that, and energy making up at least half of that basket of goods that Stats Canada uses to predict inflation, my bet is that we're going to see a pretty substantial drop, which of course could lessen pressure on our own Bank of Canada to raise interest rates, or at least stand pat and keep them where they are.
And just to get you to expand on that just a little bit, Dan, I know certainly in the Atlantic region and here in Nova Scotia, we've seen a little bit of a softening and a reduction in the price of gasoline. Diesel, not so much, but again, both coming down a little bit. Are you seeing that trend continue, for the foreseeable future? Prices remaining right now, I think here in Nova Scotia, they're around like the mid 150s, high 150s. But what are you seeing short term?
I think short term, we're still looking at prices remaining where they are, up a penny maybe this week, down a penny next week. The markets really aren't paying a lot of attention to gasoline. A lot of refineries are going through in states into maintenance, but diesel is, I think, the big issue. And when you consider that there were points this time last year where in New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, we were seeing diesel well over $3 a liter. The fact that it's down to $2 a liter is pretty significant. Home heating fuel as well. That also means aviation fuel is down. And that's likely to remain over the next week or two. I think once we start to get the colder weather, real, true, North American cold, as we do expect, usually around the second week of December and well into January, then I think we're going to start to see diesel and certainly other prices move up a lot higher.
Whenever I drive by a pump and I look at the prices or I'm filling up my car myself, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, gosh, it's not too bad right now, but imagine where it would be if there was no carbon tax or no double carbon tax on what I'm putting into my vehicle. And I mentioned that, Dan, because listen, the last couple of weeks, it's been just a dumpster fire around the carbon tax, the decision that was made to ease it on fuel, heating fuel in the Atlantic region. And then, Saskatchewan speaking out, Alberta speaking out, everyone speaking out. Let me just read you something here and then I'll get your reaction. There's someone I follow on X, mikesmoneytalks.ca, and he put a post out yesterday. Did you know that there have been no meaningful reductions in greenhouse gases emissions since 2005, despite a waterfall of new government regulations and steep tax increases? And then he has in parentheses, Canada's carbon tax isn't saving the planet. Now, of course, this is one man's post and some data there, but also opinion. But when I read that to you and everything that you know about the carbon tax and what it's doing and what it's done, what's your reaction to that?
Exercise in futility. We didn't look before we leapt. We went into this thing believing that somehow imposing taxes on people would bring down the level of so-called emissions, assuming, of course, we think that CO2 is a pollutant and the small concentrations of it in the atmosphere, certainly done by Canada, let's put it in perspective, 0.04%, of which humanity is responsible for 3% of that 0.04%, of which Canada is responsible for 1.4% of that 3% of that 0.04%. So, I mean, you have to put these things in perspective and say, is it any wonder that we're not achieving so-called targets? But here's the other thing. In that period of time, we've seen an increase in our population, which is quickly outstripping, where the demand for everything is moving up, like it or not. And is it any wonder that carbon emissions are not coming down? They're remaining where they are. They're going higher. So any way you really look at this, it's not very well thought out and not well planned. As we've proven with the clean fuel standards, we've proven with the carbon tax and the other 117 other regulations, this is a government that does not do a cost-benefit analysis. And now, of course, the cost is a political one. The benefit continues to hurt Canadians, especially those who don't get exemptions from a government that seems to pick and choose winners and losers.
Dan, I saw an infographic recently, and the source of it is Global Carbon Atlas, and it shows China in 2021, 30.9% of all the world's carbon emissions. A number of countries are there. Canada, one of the lowest at 1.5% carbon emissions globally in 2021. Why are we as Canadians made to feel like we're not doing enough and that we're the same as China, India, and other countries that are much, much higher emitters than we are? Why is that?
I think we've had the luxury of not having to pay for it. I think we've had the luxury of being brainwashed and having only one side given to us on all this. The reality is Canada could be a solution. The Indias, the Chinas, the South Koreas, et cetera, who are increasing their output could actually find themselves having a lot more natural gas from Canada. But we have a prime minister who said, no, there's no business case. We've done it to ourselves. Ignorance has a cost. Canadians are starting to pay for that. And I think we're starting to see that show up in the polls.
Dan, I know that you've got another appointment in just a couple minutes, so we'll wrap it up here. Any final thoughts before we send you off? And certainly let people know where they can find you when you're on SaltWire.
Yeah, sure. Gas Price Wizard is the site that gives you the gas predictions. My work on Twitter, Gas Price Wizard, gaswizard.ca is the gas prediction site. President at Affordable Energy, or info at affordableenergy.ca. All we're trying to do here is to make sure that people have a better understanding of the importance of energy and what policies are doing one way or another to affect us. And a country that can produce more and take advantage of its resources, as Canada can and should be, will be a prosperous one. Canada that doesn't do that is a country that's certainly going to experience some very difficult times ahead. And that's it for this week.
Dan, appreciate it. I would encourage everyone to give Dan a follow on X, formerly Twitter. Always entertaining to see your adventures on that social media platform, Dan. Appreciate your time as always. Enjoy the rest of your day. Have a great weekend, and we'll get together again next week.
You as well, Scott. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you, Dan.